Hello, students. I hope you're all well as we've taken the spring break to relax, reflect, and take appreciation for our existence here on this earth. I wanted to approach the next 7 weeks a little bit differently than I did the first 2 weeks of the COVID reboot. Initially, I had set out to do a Confer Zoom every week, but that approach didn't really feel authentic to me. That approach was somewhat encumbering for me as a professor to go through summarily things that I wanted to get across to students. The goal was to engage with students on a weekly basis. And based upon that, I thought about it and I said, well, let's see if we could do things a little bit differently as we approach this last quarter of the class, in hopes that these types of videos will be more engaging, less evasive, and to some degree more private, giving myself and my students more time to reflect, potentially more time to maybe review these types of things a couple of times during the week. More importantly, I want to thank all of you that have been participating in the class. It's very important in my mind that we utilize this opportunity in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic to take the opportunity to understand that we are mortal, understand that things are not always going to go the way one might suggest or plan, and also become more humbled, more balanced in the lives we lead as academics, professionals, husbands, wives, sons, or daughters. So you'll notice the screen that you see here is my Econ Lab page. And before I go into what I'd like you students to focus on this week, I want you to take a look at how drastically inefficient, I guess you could say, from a production possibility curve, we're inside the curve in a lot of respects. You'll notice, and I say that with compassion and with concern, and moreover with understanding that this is a time like no other. And again, I hope that your families, if you're hearing this video, that no one in your family or extended friends have been impacted by COVID-19. And if so, my sympathies are with you. So getting back to that, so keep in mind that it's important that you engage with my Econ Lab regularly in order to be successful, especially in the next couple of weeks, because we're going to be talking about market structures. We'll be expanding on the concept of if a corporation exists in a perfectly competitive environment, and we'll define that later. What are some of the fundamental tenets that a business leader, owner of a business, CEO, decision maker has to consider when it comes to economics, specifically in the area of production, efficiency? Moreover, how does a firm plan? And again, I use that term plan very loosely. What are some of the plans, some of the strategies that are necessary for the firm to make as much money as possible? Now, again, when we talk about money, you hear me talk about profit. The goal of corporations, not only to make profit, is to have some stakeholder, what we might call shared governance responsibilities, to the degree that if a firm makes money, that they put the money back into their communities, that they reinvest the money into their employees, that they reinvest the money into the technological, innovative systems, not only to make the business better in terms of profit, but moreover, give the firm a position to be able to distribute and allocate those profits in terms of wages, in terms of stock dividends, in terms of quality of product and or services, more specifically in terms of protection, consumer protection, and the litany of other risk elements that a company might be involved in. With that in mind, I'll go back to the premise. So in order for you to understand that without hearing your professor kind of go over some of the mundane theoretical pieces of market structures, it's going to be really important that you participate independently using the system. So you'll notice here that the class average right now is pretty low. And that is, this class average is only with the respect to individuals that have been engaging using my Econ lab. Now, of course, some of my students don't have computers. Of course, some of my students don't have internet. And this could have an impact on the overall outcome. I'm sharing this with you not to demean or to say to any degree that we're failing, because as I always say to my classes, fail forward. This is a temporary position that some of you have actively been spending at minimum 4 or 5 hours per week using my Econ lab. And it shows in your results. It shows by virtue of your quiz scores. It shows by virtue of some of your discussion posts and the degree to which you have engaged. So I'll leave this page, and again, I want to say welcome back. So as we embark upon this week, I'm giving my students some latitude. I know some of my students finished the Chapter 20 quiz, and some of them didn't. And that's okay, because that may have been something that I may not have set the due date of the assignment correctly. So as we begin, I'm going to the hope is that students will review Chapter 20 again. I want to talk a little bit more specifically about this concept of consumer behavior. Chapter 20. Keep in mind that consumer behavior is closely linked to the consumer surplus and shortage chapter that I had you read before the COVID-19 break when we looked at Chapter 4. And we identified the fact that there are some instances when the market failure is a byproduct of buyers and sellers' inability to come to terms, that is an equilibrium term, in terms of an optimum price and an optimum quantity. And generally speaking, this is generated whenever the price of the product changes. And so we talked about consumer surplus, we talked about producer surplus, and in that regard, we were looking at those two elements microspectively. In this chapter, we want to take a closer look at what are some of the subjective, qualitative pieces that a person purchasing a coffee from Starbucks, how does a person measure that level of consumer satisfaction, that in terms of that choice? What are some of the things that are considered? Well, of course, first and foremost, we'd say taste. If you drink Starbucks as I do, you have your blended caramel latte with almond milk, no whip, maybe add shot, either hot or cold. And the first thing you do is you sip it, either through a straw or through the cup. We feel, we taste the item. When we do that, that's a level of satisfaction that we're experiencing, but we haven't put a numerical value on it. Thus, this is the primary goal of this chapter, is to identify ways in which, or let's say economists have come up with ways, methods, and a formula to identify the maximum amount of utility experienceable when there are a multiple number of goods and services that are being purchased at one time. Of course, we'll talk about, well, I might say as an example, if you were going to McDonald's and you were buying a value meal, that your utility would be maximized because in terms of the value meal, if you eat hamburgers, if you don't, just bear with me in this scenario, if you get a meal, right? So you get a burger, you get fries, and you get a drink. So all three of those are going to have some level of utility that the person is going to experience. That level of utility, however, changes as we bite more of the hamburger, as we eat more of the fries, more importantly, as we drink more of the soda. Our job, however, is not to look at a consumer behavioral perspective when we're talking about eating an entire meal. When we look at utility from the standpoint, first and foremost, of what is the total utility, subjectively speaking, that a person will experience when consuming a good. The term utility identifies the want satisfying power of a good or service. Now, back in the supply and demand chapter, we talked about the fact that taste and preference were both demand shifters. And so it's ironic now, you'll see here in this page, that taste and preference and utility are closely linked. With that being said, the key item that we're going to focus on is the utility component. That is, what is the value now that we can place on our consumption of a good given a certain number of things that are possible? So this table that you see here is a table that represents a couple of different things. First column talks about, in this case, we're talking about digital apps. So I just purchased a new iPhone about a month ago. And generally speaking, on a regular basis, I'm going and getting apps on my phone. And each app brings me some level of utility. So you'll notice here the first app would bring John 50 utils. The second app would bring John a total of 95 utils, but marginally only 45 additional utilities, or shall I say utils. As we download more and more apps, you'll notice that the total utility increases. And this is, generally speaking, maybe not infinitely, but along a larger region. But the marginal utility is maximized at the first unit, but then begins to drop thereafter. Thus, this is what we call the law of diminishing marginal returns. Moreover, our utility is dropping. Now, when we think about this from a perspective of, as I mentioned earlier, taste or preference, one might say, well, Prof, as long as our total utility is increasing, then we're winning. And I'll give you that. That's true. But from an economics perspective, as you know, economists are looking to identify the most efficient point. That is, if planning horizon as to how many miles should you run per day to maximize your health. How many glasses of water should you drink, or ounces, to maximize health? How much should you read to maximize your overall ability to score well on an exam? More importantly, how much should you consume? And I use the term should very loosely because most of you will know, well, you might say, well, hey, that's a normative term, Professor Young. Keep in mind, I won't be too long-winded, this is the focal point of Chapter 20, and if you've done Chapter 20, most of you have already had some experience with this, and you'll see this more definitively in this exam that's going to be coming up next week. Keep in mind now that when we think about the utils themselves, marginal utility of a good, that is D, represents the digital item, that the returns are going down. They are getting smaller and smaller each time. But the critical point is, how do we assess then, from a metric perspective, the level of utility per dollar in terms of how much we're spending on the good? And using that is as a decision factor when we talk about purchasing other things simultaneously. So that formula, marginal utility of D divided by the price of D, would then also show us that relative to the price that we're paying for the good, the marginal utility per dollar declines as well. Column 3 is going to be important when we utilize the first, what we might call utility maximization formula, and then column 4 is used on the second formula to show maximizations. This week, I think it's important then that you students reread chapter 20 before we go into the next chapter, which is rents, profits, and financial positions, or let's say financial environment. So keep that in mind. Okay. Again, I have a limited amount of time that I can spend on these screencast-o-matics. So I hope that this helped to give you a focal point of what chapter 20 was talking about. I'll make another video for Thursday where I'll talk more about chapter 21 and we'll look at some of the interrelated pieces there. The only other thing that I want to show also is, before I go, is I want to bring over this Canvas page and make sure that the students are aware that the announcements will now start to change. And I'm going to be working on the module section today and tomorrow to get you prepared for this week. All right. Be safe. Hope you and your family are well. And remember, every day is an opportunity. We'll talk to you soon, students.